What if I told you that the very moment you stop chasing dollars is the moment they start noticing? That the key to making 100% of avoidance come back isn't about saying the right words, but becoming the version of you they can't ignore. This isn't about tricks or games. It's about mastering your emotional energy so powerfully that the people who once pulled away start leaning in. If you've ever been left confused, ghosted, or dismissed, this is the shift that changes everything. One of the most confusing and painful experiences in relationships is when someone starts pulling away just as you're trying to get closer. You're showing up, being open, leaning in, and suddenly they lean out. And your instinct is to chase, to explain, to fix it. But here's the truth most people miss: the more emotionally intense you become in that moment, the more you're confirming every fear that person has about intimacy. Avoidant people aren't driven by a lack of interest. They're driven by a fear of being overwhelmed, by your needs, by your emotions, by the sense that they're about to lose themselves in the process of connection. So, when you respond with emotion, crying, pleading, needing reassurance, you don't bring them closer. You activate their alarm bells. Their nervous system sees your emotion not as love, but as pressure. And pressure makes them run. This is where emotional neutrality becomes your superpower. Not emotional coldness, not shutting down, but emotional neutrality. That ability to say, I see what's happening, and I'm not going to panic. I'm not going to try to force anything. I'm grounded. Okay, that calm presence is what disarms the avoidant. It breaks the cycle. It tells their brain, this person isn't a threat to my freedom. And when they stop feeling threatened, they start feeling curious again. They start to breathe around you. And more importantly, they start to wonder about you. The thing is, most people confuse love with effort. If I love harder, they'll come around. But avoidants don't respond to effort. They respond to ease. They're not asking themselves, does this person love me enough? They're asking, can I be close to them without feeling like I'm going to suffocate? And your emotional neutrality answers that with a yes. Now, I get it. This isn't easy. It's counterintuitive because when we feel like we're losing someone, every cell in our body tells us to hold on tighter. But that's exactly the moment you need to loosen your grip. That's the moment you stop reacting and start leading. Not leading through manipulation, but through energy, through presence, through silence that speaks. When you master neutrality, you stop trying to get a response. You're not texting to provoke a reply. You're not sharing on social media in the hopes they'll see and miss you. You're not performing your healing. You're living it. And in that space, you become magnetic. Because now, they don't see you as a source of stress. They see you as the one place in their life that feels safe, stable, and strong. And guess what? That's when they come back. Not because you chased them, not because you convinced them, but because they felt something shift. They felt your calm. And in that calm, they finally had room to feel something else. Connection. So don't waste your energy reacting to their withdrawal. Don't lose yourself trying to hold on to someone who's running from themselves. Instead, anchor yourself. Be the calm in their storm. That's when everything changes. If there's one thing that flips the dynamic with an avoidant person completely on its head, it's shifting from being emotionally dependent on them to becoming genuinely outcome independent. And I don't mean pretending to not care. I don't mean playing games or using reverse psychology. I mean doing the hard inner work of reaching that place where your peace is no longer tied to whether or not they respond, return, or even stay. You see, most people are so focused on the come back part, they miss the point entirely. You're not supposed to be waiting in limbo for someone to come back. You're supposed to be coming back to yourself. And that shift, the one where you stop seeing their behavior as a reflection of your worth. That's what changes everything. Avoidant people are hyper-sensitive to pressure. The moment they feel you're emotionally hanging on their every move, they pull away, not out of cruelty, but because it feels suffocating. Ironically, that's when most people double down. They think, maybe if I show more love, maybe if I just say the right thing. But the more you try to hold on, the more they pull away. It becomes this exhausting push-pull game, and you end up drained, resentful, and confused. But when you detach, not with coldness, but with clarity, that's when you reclaim your power. When you can say, I love you, I care about you, but I'm not going to lose myself in trying to win you. Something shifts, not just for you, but for them, because now you're no longer seeking validation from them. You're not needing a response to feel whole. You're simply living your life. And here's the truth that stings at first, but sets you free. You don't actually need them to come back to be okay. That's when you stop acting out of fear. That's when your decisions are no longer about trying to manipulate an outcome, but about preserving your energy and protecting your peace. When someone feels like they're your oxygen, they panic. But when they feel like you can breathe just fine without them, something inside them starts to calm down. Now they don't feel responsible for your emotional survival. They can stop running because they're no longer trying to escape the weight of your expectations. And that's when the most surprising thing happens. They start reaching out again. They become curious, not because you chased, not because you begged, but because you created space. And in that space, they're finally able to see what you really bring, not as someone who needs them, but as someone they want. Outcome independence doesn't mean you don't care. It means you've stopped outsourcing your happiness to someone who hasn't even figured out their own. It's strength. It's grace. It's the difference between, I hope they come back, and I'll be fine either way. That energy is irresistible. So stop trying to predict their return. Start working on your own. Because when you show up for yourself the way you wish they'd show up for you, that's when the story changes. That's when everything begins to align, not just in love, but in life. There's a moment in every emotionally imbalanced dynamic where you realize you've made them the sun and you've become the satellite. Your day rises and falls with whether or not they text you back, look at you a certain way, or give you the attention you've been hoping for. And what you don't see happening in real time is that bit by bit, you're handing over the script of your self-worth for someone else to rewrite. Here's what's wild about avoidance too. They're not reacting to who you are. They're reacting to what you need from them emotionally. That need, when it's heavy, even if you think you're hiding it well, comes through loud and clear. And it's not attractive. Not because vulnerability is unattractive. It's beautiful. But because when it's wrapped in desperation, it no longer feels like intimacy. It feels like pressure. You want to turn the energy around. Stop feeding them the power of your approval. And I mean that with full honesty and love. Because the very thing you think is keeping them close, your attention, your praise, your endless patience, is often the same thing that's allowing them to stay emotionally disconnected. It's tough to admit, but most of us in these situations are performing. We're putting on this version of ourselves we think they'll find palatable, soft enough to not scare them, strong enough to seem unfazed. But deep down, we're waiting for a message, a shift, a sign that they're finally going to give us the validation we crave. And it's exhausting. You want to change the dynamic. Take your attention back, not with resentment, not with punishment, but with dignity. Because when you stop giving someone unlimited access to your emotional energy, they have to face the vacuum they've been protected from. They no longer get to live in the comfort of your endless reassurance. And it's in that discomfort that something critical happens. They either step up or step out. But either way, you win, because what you've just done is interrupted the pattern. You've stopped handing over your emotional currency to someone who hasn't earned it. You've reclaimed your inner thermostat. And suddenly, you're not cold or hot based on how they treat you. You're steady, regardless. Most people underestimate the power of removing their attention. They think, if I back off, I'll lose them. But what you're actually losing is the version of yourself who depended on breadcrumbs. What you're gaining is a version of yourself that understands attention is a privilege, not a right. When you stop chasing, when you stop emotionally rewarding someone for giving you the bare minimum, they have to reassess what you meant to them. And in that space, they often come back, not to the person who was begging for love, but to the person who realized they were the prize all along. The person who stops overgiving. The person who starts observing rather than reacting. That person, they're magnetic, not because they said the perfect thing or played some clever game, but because they finally understood that giving energy to someone who's not showing up is just borrowing from your own future peace. So if you're tired of feeling powerless, stop investing in someone who hasn't even shown you they're emotionally available. Withdraw with grace, not spite. Let silence do what your words never could. And let your absence become the mirror they didn't know they needed. One of the most misunderstood shifts you can make in dealing with an avoidant is also the most powerful. Instead of trying to make them choose you, start choosing yourself. Visibly. That doesn't mean slamming the door shut or making dramatic proclamations. It means building a life so full, so deeply aligned with your values and passions that your world no longer bends to accommodate their emotional unavailability. Because here's the truth most people won't say out loud: avoidants don't change because you love them harder. They change, if they do, because the environment no longer supports their avoidance. When you were always there, always patient, always explaining your needs with compassion, they didn't reciprocate. You were part of the system that made their behavior convenient. Not maliciously, just unintentionally. But the moment you stop orbiting around them and instead step fully into your own lane, something remarkable happens. Your attention shifts from being this open tap, constantly flowing toward them, to being something scarce, deliberate, and powerful. And it forces a recalibration, not because you manipulated them, but because the equilibrium they were relying on has changed. Most people operate under the illusion that they have to be chosen to feel worthy. That if this one person doesn't pick them, it means they weren't good enough. But what if it's the opposite? What if choosing yourself, and doing it boldly, is the act that forces them to confront the distance they've been creating? What if the most attractive thing you can do isn't trying to convince someone you're worthy, but demonstrating to yourself that you already are? You see, when you take the energy you've been pouring into proving yourself to someone else and instead reinvest it into your own evolution, your health, your purpose, your peace, you stop being in a dynamic where you're the one waiting. You're no longer the person whose value depends on someone else's ability to see it. You're the person who already knows. And when you know, it shows. It shows in how you walk away from conversations that drain you. It shows in how you no longer explain your feelings to someone who has no interest in understanding them. It shows in how you stop needing their warmth to feel whole because you've cultivated it inside yourself. People notice that, especially the ones who used to rely on your self-doubt to maintain distance. Avoidants, by nature, are drawn to the safety of control. But when they lose the emotional control they once had, when they no longer know if you're still on the hook, they begin to reassess. Not always instantly, not always permanently, but often enough that the pattern shifts. They come back not because you begged, but because you stopped begging. Not because you made them feel guilty, but because you removed the comfort of your certainty, the very certainty they took for granted. And here's the paradox that no one talks about: the moment you truly choose yourself, not as a tactic, not to get a reaction, but because it's the only path to your peace, is often the exact moment they begin to see your value in a way they never did before. Not because you changed to make them happy, but because you stopped changing yourself to avoid losing them. That's when the real power emerges. Not in controlling their behavior, but in controlling your focus. Not in waiting to be loved, but in walking in love with yourself so fiercely that anything less than reciprocity becomes obvious. Because the second you start choosing yourself unapologetically, everything that isn't meant for you naturally begins to fall away. And that includes the need for validation from someone who wasn't ready to meet you where you were. One of the most overlooked but incredibly powerful things you can do when dealing with someone avoidant is to stop filling in the silence. That might sound simple, even passive, but it's anything but. When you stop chasing, stop fixing, stop trying to decode every little behavior, they feel the weight of their own absence. And that weight can become the very thing that triggers reflection. Think about it. So many people, when they feel someone slipping away, rush in with more love, more reassurance, more effort. And I get it. It's human. It comes from a good place. You wanted to keep the connection alive, to remind them how good it could be if only they showed up. But what that often does is insulate them from the consequences of their own avoidance. They don't feel the sting of distance because you never really let them feel distant. You filled in the gaps with your effort. But what if you didn't? What if, instead of trying to rescue the connection every time it feels like it's slipping, you let it slip and paid attention to who actually reaches back? That silence isn't punishment, it's space. And space is often the most honest mirror. Because in space, they no longer get to rely on your emotional labor to maintain the illusion of closeness. In space, they have to decide whether they want to show up, whether they care enough to step forward without being pulled. Here's the thing most people don't realize: if you're always the one initiating, the one keeping the emotional pulse alive, you never really get to see what the other person is willing to do when you stop. And sometimes, the scariest but most revealing decision you can make is to do nothing. Not out of bitterness, not out of manipulation, but because doing nothing allows their intentions to surface on their own. Now, when you hold back from chasing, something fascinating happens. You begin to notice your own patterns. You notice how often you've overridden your own discomfort just to keep the peace. You notice how you've been putting in 100% effort into a relationship that's functioning on borrowed time and borrowed energy. And in that clarity, you start reclaiming parts of yourself you didn't even know you gave away. But more than that, you give the other person the opportunity to act from their own will. Not because you nudged, hinted, begged, or reminded, but because they felt something was missing and chose to move toward it. And if they don't, that silence becomes your answer. As painful as that might be, it's also incredibly freeing. Because you're no longer trapped in the cycle of if I just say the right thing, if I just wait a bit longer, if I just give more. You start living in truth, not in potential. Avoidants often come back, but not because someone knocked harder on their emotional door. They come back when the echo of your absence becomes louder than the comfort of their own detachment. When they realize the silence isn't just space, it's your boundary. And it's a boundary that says, if you want access to my energy, to my presence, to my heart, you're going to have to meet me halfway. And the best part is, when you commit to not filling in the silence, you stop betraying yourself just to make someone else feel safe. You stop playing emotional detective. You start leading with dignity, with peace, with strength. So the next time you feel the urge to chase, to fix, to explain, pause. Let the silence do what your words never could. Let it show you who's really listening. One of the most misunderstood ideas in relationships is that the more available and accommodating you are, the more someone will appreciate you. We think that by being constantly present, constantly forgiving, constantly flexible, we're building a stronger connection. But here's what actually happens when you make yourself too available to someone who is emotionally avoidant. You give them zero incentive to change. In fact, you give them all the space in the world to stay exactly the same, because they know no matter how little they show up, you'll still be there. This is what I want you to understand. There's a difference between being kind and being a doormat. There's a difference between being patient and abandoning your own standards. And when you continue to give someone access to your emotional world without requiring any effort, consistency, or accountability in return, you're teaching them how little they have to try. You're not inspiring their affection. You're enabling their indifference. Avoidants operate from a core belief that closeness is a threat to their freedom. So the moment things get too emotionally intense, they pull back. But here's where it gets interesting. They're not oblivious to connection. They still feel something when it's gone. They just respond differently. They don't chase, they observe. And if you're still there, waiting, when they eventually turn around, you've just confirmed to them that they can disappear, detach, emotionally withdraw, and the cost will be nothing. You will be exactly where they left you. That doesn't make them love you more. It makes you invisible. Now imagine what happens when that pattern breaks. Imagine instead of making excuses for their behavior, you calmly but firmly raise your standards. You remove your availability. Not to play games, but because your energy is a privilege, not a guarantee. Suddenly, they're not in control of the dynamic anymore. And that shift in power isn't just noticed, it's felt. Because when someone knows you're no longer waiting on them to show up right, the dynamic transforms. They're forced to evaluate your worth in your absence. They can't lean on your emotional generosity to maintain the illusion of a functioning connection. They have to make a decision, either step up or step aside. Now, the real strength here is not in hoping they come back. It's in being okay if they don't. It's in valuing your peace over their potential. It's in recognizing that being available isn't the same thing as being chosen. Because if someone truly values you, they won't keep testing how much you'll tolerate. They'll meet you in the middle. They'll put in the work. They'll show up without needing a crisis to force their hand. This doesn't mean you stop loving. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you love with boundaries. You care with clarity. You protect your own emotional environment so that anyone who enters it knows they're not stepping into chaos. They're stepping into something intentional, something sacred. And when that shift happens, when your availability starts reflecting your self-worth, people either rise to meet it or reveal they never intended to in the first place. Either way, you win, because you're not just reacting anymore, you're choosing. And choice is where your power lies. So if there's one thing I want you to walk away with, it's this. The power to change the dynamic doesn't lie in trying harder to be understood, accepted, or loved by someone who keeps running from intimacy. It lies in what you choose to tolerate, in the boundaries you set, in the standards you uphold when it would be easier to lower them. You don't get someone back by chasing them. You get them back, or you get your peace by standing in your worth and refusing to beg for what should be freely given. Either they step forward and meet you at the level you deserve, or life clears the space for something better. And both of those outcomes are a win.